What was the weirdest/oddest/most shocking thing you found when clearing out the things of someone who passed on? So, I had a friend some years ago. She was quite sexually exploratory. She was unfortunately hit by a car, no one's fault, just an accident, and died. In my friend group that she was a part of, we decided that her parents should not have to deal with her adult toys. She had a sex swing and a machina thingy, so we broke into her apartment and stole her adult toys. It was the weirdest experience ever, but I think she would have laughed her ass off over it. You're a good friend. I bet she would have been grateful you spared her family and happy you had fun doing it. Physical adaptation of clear my browser history. A friend of mine died of leukemia several years ago, before his family had a chance to go through his stuff. His friends who didn't need to break in thankfully purged all of that stuff. After that, a bunch of us got together and made up sealed envelopes that were locked in one trusted friend's safe. Everyone included whatever instructions they wanted followed if they died or were severely injured, from emergency contact info to social media passwords to where their intercourse toys or drugs or fetish wear or whatever was hidden, what hard drives to wipe, spare house keys, and so on. All of the stuff you'd want your closest friends to take care of. It's been years since we all did that, and it's probably time to update everything. I used to work for an auction house that would come in after a person died, usually at instruction of their child who didn't have the time to deal with it themselves, and catalog everything then sell it. We saw amazing things. Perfectly preserved baby toys from the 20s and 30s. Sets of family china from great whoever's wedding perfectly packed away. One house looked like it was frozen in the 60s. No new appliances or furniture, just original style maintained perfectly by grandma till her death. The best find was a hidden archive of World War II memorabilia from when the deceased person fought in the war. He clearly hid it away from sight and mind. Back of a basement closet, we found guns, tons of medals and patches, a rolled uniform, and a few pictures. We called their child to ask if they wanted to keep any of this. We noted that some of the medals were very important, but they had us get rid of everything. I had to look up each one before placing it on the market, and that man saved a lot of ass in his day. We called their child to ask if they wanted to keep any of this. We noted that some of the medals were very important, but they had us get rid of everything. Or that's just sad. I'm relieved to find a comment that's not the usual combination of relations and drug related stuff everyone else is posting about. Not quite the same, but our office cleaner told me about the time they lifted the carpets in their house to find a whole set of Polaroid photos from intercourse parties that took place in the house by the previous occupants. She said there were quite a few faces she recognized still in the village. That's a treasure. It's the urban version of forest porn. When you're done with it, you're supposed to leave it under someone else's carpet for the next generation to discover. This is one from the lighter side. When I was growing up, my grandfather was never into sports. He encouraged us to play and even took us to a handful of pro games, but he barely enjoyed it himself. He always said that following pro sports was nice for kids, but there's something wrong with adults who do so. When he died, my sister and me found his secret stash. Dun dun dun. It was a couple old trunks full of Boston Braves memorabilia. There was game jerseys and t-shirts, signed bubblegum cards, souvenir bats and hats, and at least 100 ticket stubs. Apparently he was as a hardcore president of the Boston Braves fan club level aficionado. When the Braves left Boston in 1952, it broke his sports fan heart in a way that he never recovered. Not the most tragic tale, and it's even a bit amusing, but it's kind of sad too. Being a Braves fan was his thing. It was his guilty pleasure, his passion, and apparently part of his identity. Then they left, and he was never the same. I can definitely understand his statement about adults and kids. When you believe in something that much, and it gets stripped from you, there is a degree of bitterness, resentment, and so much more so, loss. If you let your love go in your youth, you become an adult that doesn't feel the inevitable sorrow. That's just my opinion though. If you'll still have all that memorabilia, it could be worth quite a bit these days. Or even just snapping a pic of it all and posting it on the Braves subreddit would definitely let some fans lust over it. My husband's first wife died of cancer a few years before we started dating. When she died, he didn't have the time or energy to deal with a lot of her things, so he basically just packed everything up into boxes and stuck them in the basement. Years and years later, we were engaged and about to move, so we decided to go through the boxes together. We knew she was begin to snowboarding, but we didn't know how much until then. We found various pictures of her out on the slopes with Jake Burton, founder of Burton Snowboards, Mike Carlson, founder of Lip Technologies which produces Roxy Snowboards and a few other brands, and David Kemper, founder of Kemper Snowboards. Apparently she was tight with the pioneers of snowboarding. That's not weird, that's cool laugh. As a keen snowboarder, this story really connected with me, especially as Jake Burton is gone now too. Thanks for sharing. I'm really thankful this one wasn't weird. When my grandmother died, we were going through her closets and found a marriage license for my grandfather and another woman, dated 6 months before he married my grandmother. Apparently, he got jilted and Mima caught him on the rebound. My mom knew the woman and had never heard about a relationship between her and Granddaddy. We found out Grandpa was married to another woman. She died maybe tuberculosis. Then he married Grandma. The weird thing was that some of my cousins were absolutely devastated by this news. The thought of a grandparent being married before shook them to their core. I don't understand, but it was traumatic for some of the grandkids. Clearing out my mill house, we found 2 LTR ice cream tubs full of used syringes. They were for her cat who was diabetic, but he died 5 years previously. At least she didn't toss medical waste in the normal trash. I had to give myself allergy shots for a couple of years. They instruct you to put the used syringes in a sturdy container. I used empty peanut jars, usually hard plastic. Once it's full, you tape it up or otherwise securely seal it and throw it out. Safer for sanitation workers and really everyone, since they could easily rip through a garbage bag. Anyway, long story short, too late. Maybe she just didn't know if it was safe to toss in regular garbage because it is technically biohazard. My grandmother, growing up on a North Carolina farm, she was able to take French in high school because my great grandparents insisted on it being available in the local school. She had a pen pal in France who was about the same age. She had a series of letters from her pen pal, with the very last one saying, "They say that the Nazis are almost here, see edit." He sent a newspaper saying it, not a letter, as the last thing he sent. Edit. Having so many people offering help figure out the details has encouraged me to find out more. Just spoke to my mother and aunt. Apparently, it wasn't the last letter that said that, but that her pen pal sent her a newspaper with a headline that said that the Nazis were almost there or something like that. It was the last thing my grandmother received from him. The last actual few letters before that seemed like something that was a boring school project. My mother has the newspaper, but said it practically disintegrates when she touches it, but she can scan it. She has the letters, but again, they aren't as interesting. Also, the pen pal was in the middle of France, not a major city. Street. Echin, she said St. Stephen from memory, but has to go find it. Further, the letters from the pen pal have an address. My mother is open to sending them to this person's family. She brought it up. But then there's the question of if that's something they would even want or not. Edit 2. People are asking for more info. When I get it, I will do so. Edit 3. My mother saved pictures of the pen pal and his brother that were with the letters to my grandmother and postcards from his town that he sent, so my grandmother could see his town. But we only have the last 2 letters, and not ones before that. Did she ever try to figure out what happened to her pen pal? Horribly abusive father-in-law died recently. Mill left him a few years ago. Found multiple copies of her house keys and garage door openers, as well as various tools and personal belongings that he had stolen from her, so that she'd need his help fixing things around her house. What a scummy, manipulative thing to do. I hope your Mill is happier nowadays. Wow, that's a pretty high level of nasty right there. A toxic love transcends time. When my grandpa died, we were going through his stuff to see if we wanted to keep anything, and found an old porno paperback book. It was called something like Linda's Lusty Night. It was super corny compared to today's standards, but still raunchy. Me, my brother, and cousins were reading lines of the book out loud to each other. It was hilarious. Edit. Freudian slip. My friend inherited dozens of Mills and Bowen's cheap paperback pornos. When his grandma died, he jokingly called them Mills and Poons and burned them cause nobody would accept them as a donation. Just going to take a moment to plug My Dad Wrote a Porno, an amazing podcast where 3 friends rip on the host's dad's erotic novels. The book is corny as hell, hilarious as hell, and the podcast is pretty much exactly what you described in your last line. Edit, and the new season begins tomorrow. Edit 2, or right now. It's out right now. Grandma had a bunch of burnt pots and pans in her closet. She was trying to hide the fact she was going senile and didn't know if it was okay to just throw them in the trash. This is heart-wrenching. My great-grandpa just passed and yeah, apparently the house was just covered in orange juice cartons of all things. I'm dealing with this type of behavior with my dad right now. It's heartbreaking. We found out my grandfather was an ambulance driver / medic in Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. We found his dog tags, orders, pictures and everything. He had always claimed he was in the army, but stayed in California. He never talked to anyone about it. Not his wife, his brothers, his children. When he passed away in '92, 2 old vets showed up and talked about him saving their life. I think this is maybe more common than we think. I know my grandfather was in the OST during WWII in occupied France. But he very rarely talked about anything substantial. He did much of which was / is classified still. Much of what we know comes from stories of other people and has mentioned in a couple books, but not much detail. But he himself was pretty unassuming about it and didn't like to talk about the war. My great uncle, who was an army engineer at the same time, was the same way. I think a lot of people just wanted to put it behind them. It's nice finding out how common this really was. My grandfather was in France during the Bulge and was wounded when his jeep flipped after an explosion mine, mortar, grenade? No idea at all, only knew this because he had a purple heart and that's all he'd disclose. He was on the sister ship of the Leopoldville when it went down, but that's literally all I know about his time in the service. Well, and that it absolutely haunted him, which is why he'd never openly discuss it. My grandpa never talked about his time in the Wehrmacht. All I know from my grandma was that he fought in Italy. He was injured and couldn't move one of his arms. I think a lot of vets don't talk about this time. When my grandma died, my mom and my aunt asked me to be the one to go through her closets. I found a lot of interesting stuff, but the most shocking was her personal diary dating back more than 40 years. My granda cheated on her very openly, which I already knew, but she never talked about it. Reading her own perspective on the story was a wild ride. I didn't keep the diary. My mom didn't want it either, so I just gave it to my aunt. Don't know if she kept it. And X200B. Edit. Wow. I wasn't expecting this to get so much attention. I guess I now have to tell the full story. So the area where I live is an urban place now, but in the 60s/70s, when this story took place, it was fairly rural. And this story goes the way rural stories tend to go. It's also worth noting that this story takes place in South America, so culture is a bit different. My grandparents didn't get too much chance to know each other before marriage. He was a friend of a family member. He was introduced to her, and they married a few months later. They had 5 children, but as the years passed he just grew discontent. I don't remember the words she used specifically, but the main point is that he was looking for more, if you know what I mean. He started cheating on her. According to her diary, she knew, but she decided not to do anything drastic out of fear of not being able to support her family by herself. 5 children are a lot of mouths to feed. But it all came to a head when she heard that her husband had an extra marriage son. At this point she kicked him out of the house. The diary doesn't describe it that way, but it's essentially what happened. The most interesting part is what happens next. The mother of my granddad's other children was, to put it lightly, a biatch. The diary doesn't go into detail, but my grandma heard that the kids were neglected and abused. So, she asked her husband to bring her the children. So, my grandma took care of his husband's extramarital children, a boy and a girl, aged 5 and 4 respectively, if I remember right. So now she had 7 children in her house that she was taking care of. The diary doesn't directly say what happens next, but inquiring from my oldest aunt, who remembers the ordeal. After several years, my granddad's mistress came to the house and demanded to take the children away. The most interesting part of reading the diary was seeing the way she described her own feelings. The first few chapters were heartbreaking to read, but she wrote it in a very hopeful tone. The last page of the diary was a confession, where she said that she forgave her husband and his mistress for everything they'd done to her. While I was reading it, I could feel her heartbreak. My grandparents never legally divorced, but they lived separately for the rest of their lives. He built a house in another rural area. That area is still rural today, and the house still stands where he lived for a few decades before moving in with one of my aunts. He died in 2017 and my grandma died in 2018 during my grandma's funeral. So, before I discovered the diary, the oldest son of my granddad's mistress said that he considers my grandma to be her real mother. She cared for him and his sister when nobody else did, and he said that thanks to her he's still here. He and his sister are part of the family as far as we're concerned. As for their mother, I have no idea what happened to her. My grandmother was the sweetest person I've ever known, and it honestly amazes me that she went through so much and managed to stay hopeful and positive. That must have been so hard to read, and even harder for her to live through. My mum and dad, I was helping, were clearing out my granddad's place when I found his collection of shrunken heads he had acquired when he was in the merchant navy in an old box under his bed. Those are quite rare. Some old farmer died in the village I grew up in. Well, when cleaning out his farm they found a fully functional and maintained anti-tank gun Pak 34, if I remember correctly, plus ammo. You never know when the ICE is going to send a tank for tax fraud. Gotta be prepared. Sometimes these rude young'uns just can't keep their hands off my tatters. I found a big black dildo the size of my arm and a load of BBC porn when I was clearing out my great aunt's place. The weirdest thing is that she was insanely racist. Racial fetishism is a problem, and it's largely fueled by porn. The very term you used, BBC, is a porn thing. Asian women particularly suffer from it, getting all sorts of creeps who aren't interested in them as people, but just fetishize them. So it's not as weird as you might think that someone who doesn't like black people is able to reduce them to relations objects. My grandma was a child of the Depression, and as such didn't trust banks. She lived alone for years, and towards the end started developing dementia. When she had to be moved for care, we found Ziploc baggies with thousands of dollars hidden all over the house, in the deep freeze, taped the back of furniture and underneath tables, in the backs of the toilet, etc. Her house was sold to placate Medicaid, and the people who bought it were her long-term neighbors who loved her very much. They called another 5 or so times when they found even more money in the floor, the cellar, the shed. I believe there is probably still money hidden that we'll never know about. She spent her last years on social security, budgeting every dime, and all the while was sitting on a small fortune. Thankfully Medicaid didn't know about her stash, so the family got to keep it all. This reminds me of when my aunt passed away many years ago. She lived in a small apartment that had gone entirely unchanged my whole life. Same 60s furniture, same console TV, etc. She lived comfortably, but didn't spend hardly any money at all. When she passed away, it turned out she had a high 8-figure bank account that nobody had known about but her, I suppose. This is actually pretty common. I have a friend whose husband died, and in the months following my friend found 70k plus hidden in more than a dozen stashes around their house.